It's been revealed that French energy giant Engie shifted $1 billion out of its Australian subsidiaries just before receiving compensation under the carbon tax. The Paradise Papers documents from law firm Appleby reveal a secret plan called Project Salmon to send profits upstream from Victoria's Loy Yang B power station to parent companies in Britain. Business reporter Michael Janda joins us now. Michael, g'day. So what's this all about?
Hey Joe, well I love the name Project Salmon because it's all about upstreaming profits, and they're very creative in that naming of the project. But basically what we've come to understand from months of analysing these documents, and one of the reasons that this didn't get covered in the Four Corners is that it's taken so long to try and get an understanding of exactly what this project was about, was that for basically a decade prior to this 2012 transaction, almost a decade, International Power, which is now owned by Engie and part of that company, was, instead of taking dividends from its Australian operations, borrowing money from them because that was tax-free in the UK to bring the money back as loans. In return, the Australian companies, the subsidiaries, received assets, the debts that the British company owed to them, and those, on top of those, the interests that the British companies owed to them, again without tax. And what happened in 2012 is that finally the British tax law looked like it was going to change around those interest-free loans, and so they've decided to wrap it up. The British tax law had already changed to make dividends from offshore tax-free to bring back to the UK, so they've basically turned $1 billion in debt that they owed to the Australian companies into a $1 billion dividend payment from the Australian companies to the parents. No cash changing hands, but $1 billion of assets that were on the books of the Australian companies stripped out.
And so how does this work in with the carbon tax and compensation?
Look, it's probably just a matter of A, coincidental timing, and B, a bit of convenient timing, because within a few days of paying this $1 billion in non-cash dividends back to the parent companies in the UK, Loy Yang B power station, which is the company involved here in Australia, the Engie company involved, it received a $117 million cash payment from the federal government as part of the carbon tax compensation. And then it was going to receive $112 million per year worth of carbon credits for the first 4 years of the carbon pricing scheme. Now, I've spoken to people who are involved in designing the carbon pricing scheme, and the intent of that was to set it at a level that these companies wouldn't breach their debt agreements and wouldn't be at risk of going bankrupt and shutting down and turning out the lights.
So, so that figure that was moved out of Australia would have had an impact on the compensation they were receiving if the government knew about that money?
Well, it's not even necessarily so much that, but that was an asset that the Australian company had, that $1 billion, and Engie's argument to us is that this is all non-cash. I mean, in some ways the money had already moved out in the loans, but the thing was, by doing this Project Salmon transaction, what was a $1 billion obligation from the parent companies that they had to meet to these Australian subsidiaries was just wiped out. It was cancelled, and that left the Australian companies with $1 billion less assets, $1 billion less in equity, and then within 3 years of that they ended up warning in their annual reports that they were in danger of breaching their loan agreements, their banking covenants.
So there's no suggestion that anything illegal has happened here, but maybe unethical?
Well, it seems to be perfectly legal. In fact, throughout the documents we've seen, there's the Australian company's group tax manager was involved in drafting them together with PwC in the UK on the British tax implications, and it all seems to dot all the I's and cross all the T's, and it's been very carefully crafted to comply with the laws. They even had a declaration from the Australian Tax Office, so they've clearly gone to the ATO, and they've said in the documents that the ATO said there would be no dividend withholding tax obligations on some of these transactions out of Australia to some of the subsidiaries. But some of these subsidiary companies in the Cayman Islands, in the Netherlands, in Cyprus, so we've got known and notorious tax haven subsidiaries involved in a very complex transaction, and we've actually got a graphic of it, Joe. We could pull that up, and it shows you just how complex it is. it makes no sense when you look when you look at it on
Looks like
on
that
the
spaghetti
screen.
I had last night.
Exactly, it does, and this is why it took us months. And we've been working on this with Neil Chenoweth from the Financial Review, a very experienced business and finance journalist, journalist from Le Monde and Guardian Australia as well. And it took the four groups months to actually get some understanding of what Engie was actually doing here.
Yeah, and can you give us an idea just to, in terms of explaining that graph? Difficult, but like what are the blue highlighted areas and what are the red square highlighted areas?
Yeah, so the blue highlighted areas are basically the various Australian companies and subsidiaries and their relationships to each other and those co-ownership structures. And then you've got the red companies, which are the overseas parent companies, which is where the money ultimately went to. This is just phase one of the plan, but you can see how many transactions are involved. And these
Perfectly straightforward.
These all happened within 1 or 2 days. That was an essential part of the plan. The transactions had to happen virtually simultaneously so as not to trigger some of the tax rules in the UK in particular that could have resulted in tax having to be paid on this transfer of money.
So in the wake of the Paradise Papers, and we've had a number of stories over the past week about the Paradise Papers, is the hope that we won't see those sort of structures that we saw just there set up in future, and that there will be laws to ensure that things are much more clear and transparent?
Well, you'd hope so, Joe, because when you think about it, aside from any lost revenue, even if this would have been double taxation on Engie, because there's no suggestion from Project Salmon that it was involved in reducing taxes on the profits they made in Australia, taxes in Australia to the ATO. This does seem to be more about UK tax on getting the money back. But even if that is the case, there's some, considerable hours of very intelligent people's work has gone into creating this hugely, convoluted structure through tax havens, through multiple jurisdictions. And aside from anything else, it's really just a waste of time that multinationals are spending so much resources setting up shell companies in places like the Cayman Islands just to avoid some of their taxation obligations.
But presumably it's not a waste of time if they're saving heaps of money.
Yeah, they're saving heaps of money, but it's coming at the cost of revenue that funds social services.
Exactly. Okay, Michael Janda, thanks so much for that. And can we expect anything else from the Paradise Papers?
There are actually a few more things in there, and I think there's 13.4 million documents, Joe, and a limited team of there are almost 400 journos looking at them, but there's still a lot we haven't seen in those documents.
Okay, thanks, Michael Janda.